Have you ever received a message from someone who should not be able to contact you? Sarah was 30 years old. She was a teacher. She lived alone in a small apartment. Her life was simple. She worked. She came home. She watched television. Then she went to bed. But one Monday morning, Sarah received an email. The subject said, "Please don't make the same mistake." Sarah looked at the screen. She did not know the sender. She opened the email. There was only one sentence. "Sarah, you have exactly 1 year to change your life." Sarah laughed. Very funny. She almost deleted the message. But then she saw the name of the sender. Sarah Miller. Her own name. Sarah felt confused. She looked at the email again. The sender's address was strange. There were no numbers, no company name, just her name. She closed the email. She decided to forget about it. But 10 minutes later, another email arrived. Sarah looked at the screen. This time, the message said, "Tomorrow, you will meet a man in a blue coat." Sarah stopped breathing. She looked at the clock. Then she whispered, "Who are you?" No answer came. Sarah went to work. She tried to forget the strange emails. But all day, she kept thinking about the message. The next morning, Sarah walked to the bus stop. She looked around. People were everywhere. Cars, buses, students, workers. Then she saw him, a man in a blue coat. Sarah froze. The man was standing across the street. He looked directly at her. Then he smiled. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. She wanted to run, but the man crossed the street. He walked toward her, and when he finally stopped, he said 4 words. "Sarah, I know your future." Sarah stared at the man. She could not speak. The man smiled again. "Sarah, are you okay?" She took 1 step back. "Who are you?" The man looked surprised. "You don't remember me?" "No." "Have we met before?" The man looked at her for a few seconds. Then he said, "Not yet." Sarah felt a cold feeling in her stomach. "What does that mean?" The man looked around. "Not here. Come with me." Sarah shook her head. "Absolutely not." The man smiled. "Good." Sarah frowned. "Good. You are finally learning to say no." Sarah became even more confused. "Who are you?" The man took a deep breath. "My name is David." "David what?" "Just David." Sarah looked at him. "How do you know my name?" David did not answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket. Then he gave Sarah a small envelope. Sarah looked at it. Her name was written on the front. She slowly opened it. Inside, there was a photograph. Sarah looked at the photograph. Her heart stopped. It was a picture of her. But Sarah had never seen that picture before. She was sitting in a small house. She was older, much older, maybe 50 years old. Sarah looked at David. "What is this?" David looked at her seriously. That is you. Sarah laughed nervously. That's impossible. Look at the woman beside you. Sarah looked at the photograph again. A woman was standing next to her. Sarah knew that woman. It was her mother, but her mother looked very old. Sarah's hands began to shake. Where did you get this? David answered quietly. From your house. Sarah looked at him. What house? David took one step closer. Your house. Sarah felt dizzy. She looked at the photograph again. Then she looked at David. Who are you? David finally answered. I am your son. Sarah stopped breathing. For a few seconds, the world became completely silent. Then Sarah laughed. It was a nervous laugh. No, that's impossible. David looked at her with sad eyes. I know. That's what I said too. Sarah stared at him. How old are you? David looked down. 27. Sarah felt the world moving around her. She was 30 years old. This man was older than her. She looked at him again. How can you be my son? David whispered. Because I am from the future. Sarah looked at David. She did not know what to say. Finally, she asked, How did you find me? David looked at the ground. I have been looking for you for a long time. Why? Because you disappeared. Sarah frowned. I disappeared? David nodded. From my life. Sarah felt confused. I don't understand. David took a deep breath. You were my mother. Past tense. David looked at her. Yes. Sarah felt a strange pain in her chest. What happened? David looked away. You left. Sarah stared at him. I would never leave my child. David gave a sad smile. That's what you believe now. Sarah looked at the photograph. The older version of herself was smiling, but her eyes looked tired. What happened to me? David was silent. Then he said, You became very successful. Sarah almost laughed. That sounds good. It wasn't. Sarah looked at him. Why? Because you forgot everyone. Sarah felt angry. That is not true. David looked directly into her eyes. You forgot your mother. Sarah froze. My mother? Yes. She waited for you. She called you. You always said you were busy. Sarah felt a cold feeling in her body. She remembered the emails. She remembered the strange words. Please don't make the same mistake. David continued. You said you would visit her later, but later never came. Sarah looked down. Is my mother dead? David did not answer immediately. Then he quietly said, Yes. Sarah closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her face. How long ago? 5 years. Sarah covered her mouth. She could not breathe. David looked at her. I did not come here to change the past. Then why are you here? David took the old photograph from her hand. Because I know what you become. Sarah looked at him. And what do I become? David's voice became softer. Someone who has everything but feels completely alone. Sarah said nothing. David took out another envelope. This one was much older. He gave it to her. Sarah looked at the envelope. There was only one sentence written on it. Open this when you are ready to hear the truth. Sarah looked at David. What's inside? David stepped back. Your future. Sarah slowly opened the envelope, and when she saw the first line, her hands began to shake, because the letter started with the words, Dear Sarah, I am sorry I became you. Sarah read the letter again. I am sorry I became you. She did not understand. She looked at David. What does that mean? David looked sad. Keep reading. Sarah continued. Sarah, if you are reading this, you have already met David. Please listen to him. I know you don't trust him. I know this sounds impossible, but I promise he is telling the truth. You have 1 year. 1 year to change your life. 1 year to save the people you love. Do not make my mistakes. Do not choose work over your family. Do not say, I will do it tomorrow. Tomorrow is the word that destroyed my life. I had a beautiful family. I had a son. I had a mother. I had people who loved me. But I was always busy. I always wanted more. More money. More success. More respect. And one day, I looked around, and everyone was gone. I became successful. But I became you. And I hate myself for it. Sarah stopped reading. She could not continue. David was standing quietly in front of her. Sarah looked at him. Did I write this? David nodded. Yes. Sarah felt tears in her eyes. Why would I write this? Because you finally understood. Understood what? David looked at her. That you were losing everything. Sarah looked at the letter. Then why didn't I change? David was silent. Sarah looked at him again. Why didn't I change? David slowly answered. Because you thought you still had time. Sarah closed her eyes. Those words hurt more than anything. She remembered the email. You have exactly 1 year to change your life. She looked at David. Why 1 year? David took a deep breath. Because in 1 year, something happens. Sarah felt afraid. What happens? David looked at her. You lose the person you love most. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. Who? David said nothing. Sarah took a step toward him. Who do I lose? David looked at her with tears in his eyes. Then he said, Me. Sarah could not move. She looked at David. Me? David nodded. Yes. How? David looked down. I was sick. Sarah felt her heart break. Can you be saved? David shook his head. Not in my time. Sarah began to cry. Then why are you here? David looked at her. Because you can change the future. Sarah wiped her tears. How? By changing yourself. Sarah looked confused. That's all. David nodded. That's everything. He took a deep breath. You think your future is about money. You think it is about success. You think you need to work harder. But that is not your problem. Sarah looked at him. Then what is my problem? David answered quietly. You are always waiting. Waiting for the right time. Waiting for more money. Waiting for less work. Waiting for tomorrow. Sarah looked away. David continued. One day, you will understand. But by then, it will be too late. Sarah thought about her mother. She thought about her friends. She thought about the people she had ignored. Then she remembered something. Wait. David looked at her. How do you know about my mother? David said nothing. Sarah took a step toward him. How do you know I always say I am busy? David looked at her with sad eyes. Because I heard you say it. When? David whispered. Every day. Sarah felt confused. What do you mean? David looked at his watch. I have to go. Sarah grabbed his arm. No. Wait. Where are you going? David looked at her. I will see you again. When? David smiled sadly. In 1 year. Sarah held his arm tighter. How do I find you? David looked into her eyes. You don't. Sarah froze. What? David slowly removed his arm. I find you. Then he walked away. Sarah stood there. She watched him disappear into the crowd. She looked at the photograph, then at the letter. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly afraid of the future. That evening, she went home. She opened her calendar and marked one date, exactly 1 year from that day. Then she wrote one sentence. Change everything. The next morning, Sarah did something she had not done in 10 years. She called her mother. Her mother answered. Hello. Sarah closed her eyes. Hi, Mom. There was silence. Then her mother said, Sarah. Sarah began to cry. Yes, I'm here. Her mother immediately knew something was wrong. What happened? Sarah smiled through her tears. Nothing happened. I just wanted to hear your voice. Her mother was silent. Then she said, I love you, sweetheart. Sarah closed her eyes. I love you too. But Sarah did not know. Someone was listening to the entire conversation. And that person was not David. Sarah spent the next few days thinking about David. She tried to continue her normal life. She went to work. She taught her students. She came home. But everything felt different now. She looked at people differently. She listened more carefully. She noticed things she had ignored before. One morning, Sarah arrived at school early. The building was almost empty. She walked through the quiet halls. Then she heard a voice. Sarah. She turned around. It was Emily, one of her former students. Sarah smiled. Emily? Emily looked nervous. I need to talk to you. Sarah nodded. Of course. They sat in an empty classroom. Emily looked at the floor. My father lost his job. Sarah listened. My mother is sick. Emily took a deep breath. I want to leave school. Sarah looked at her. Why? Because I need to work. Sarah was quiet. She remembered David's words. You have everything, but you feel alone. Sarah looked at Emily. What do you really want? Emily looked surprised. No one has asked me that. Sarah smiled gently. Then I'm asking you now. Emily began to cry. Sarah listened. She did not hurry. She did not look at the clock. She did not think about work. For the first time, she simply stayed. After Emily left, Sarah sat alone in the classroom. She looked at the clock. She had spent almost 2 hours listening, and strangely, she did not feel tired. She felt happy. That evening, Sarah opened her computer. She looked at her work schedule. Then she did something unexpected. She resigned from her second job, the job that had taken all her evenings. It was difficult. She would earn less money, but she knew something now. More money did not mean more life. The next morning, Sarah called her mother. Mom. Yes, sweetheart. Would you like to have dinner with me tonight? Her mother laughed. Of course. Sarah smiled. Then she asked, Can I come to your house? Her mother became quiet. Sarah. Yes. I have been waiting for you to ask that question for 10 years. Sarah closed her eyes. I know. That night, Sarah and her mother sat together at the kitchen table. They talked for hours. Her mother told stories about Sarah's childhood. Sarah laughed. Then her mother suddenly became serious. Sarah. Yes. Can I ask you something? Of course. Her mother looked at her. Are you afraid of something? Sarah froze. She thought about David. She thought about the letter. Then she answered honestly. Yes. Her mother waited. Sarah looked into her eyes. I'm afraid of losing you. Her mother reached across the table. She held Sarah's hand. Then don't waste the time you have with me. Sarah began to cry. But this time, she understood. Time was not waiting for her. And somewhere, in a future she had never seen, a man named David was waiting too. 1 month passed. Then 2 months. Sarah's life continued to change. She spent more time with her mother. She called her friends. She visited old students. She even started writing in a small notebook. Every night, she wrote one question. What did I do today that truly mattered? At first, she didn't know how to answer, but slowly, her answers changed. I listened to my mother. I called an old friend. I helped Emily. I spent time with someone I love. Sarah began to understand. A meaningful life was not always about big achievements. Sometimes it was about small moments. One evening, Sarah was walking home. The streets were quiet. She passed a small coffee shop. Then she saw him, David. He was sitting alone by the window. Sarah stopped immediately. Her heart began to beat faster. She opened the door. David looked up. He smiled. "You found me." Sarah sat across from him. "I thought you said I wouldn't find you." David laughed softly. "I said you wouldn't find me." Sarah looked at him. "Then why are you here?" David became serious. "Because you changed." Sarah frowned. "How do you know?" David looked around the coffee shop. "Because I remember this place." Sarah felt confused. "What do you mean?" David looked at her. "You used to come here every Friday." Sarah shook her head. "I have never been here before." David smiled sadly. "Not yet." Sarah stared at him. David reached into his pocket. He took out a small photograph. Sarah looked at it. Her eyes became wide. It showed Sarah sitting in the same coffee shop. She was older, much older, and sitting across from her was David. But this time, David was a little boy. Sarah looked at him. "What is this?" David whispered. "Your first memory of me." Sarah felt dizzy. "That is impossible." David shook his head. "No, you just haven't lived it yet." Sarah looked at the photograph. Then she looked at David. "Tell me the truth." David became silent. Sarah continued. "Why did you really come back?" David slowly answered. "I didn't come back to save you." Sarah stared at him. "Then why?" David looked directly into her eyes. "I came back because you asked me to." Sarah could not speak. "You asked me to?" David nodded. "Yes." "When?" David looked at her. "In the future." Sarah felt confused. "Why would I ask you to come back?" David took a deep breath. "Because one day you will understand everything." Sarah looked at the photograph. "What happens to me?" David was quiet. Then he said, "You become successful." Sarah smiled sadly. "That doesn't sound so bad." David looked at her. "You become very rich, very powerful. Everyone knows your name." Sarah waited. "But," David looked down. "But you lose your mother." Sarah closed her eyes. David continued. "Then you lose your friends. Then you lose me." Sarah began to cry. "Why do I lose you?" David looked at her. "Because I become like you." Sarah opened her eyes. "What does that mean?" "I become busy. I stop calling. I stop visiting. I tell myself I will have more time later." Sarah could not breathe. "Like me?" David nodded. "Exactly like you." Sarah looked at the photograph. "Then what happens?" David answered quietly. "I become successful, but I become completely alone." Sarah cried silently. David reached across the table. He held her hand. "That's when you finally understand." "Understand what?" "That you did not lose your family in one day." Sarah looked at him. "You lost us slowly. One missed call. One canceled dinner. One promise to call tomorrow. One more hour at work. David's voice began to shake. That's why you wrote the letter. Sarah looked at him. What letter? The letter I gave you. Sarah suddenly understood. She looked at David. You came here because I asked you to change the past. David shook his head. No. Sarah frowned. Then why? David smiled sadly. You asked me to remind you. Remind me of what? David looked directly into her eyes. Who you were. Before you forgot what mattered. Sarah cried. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah asked, Will I ever see you again? David smiled. Yes. When? David stood up. 1 year from today. Sarah looked confused. Why? David looked at her. Because that's when you will need me most. Sarah stood up. Wait. David walked toward the door. Sarah followed him. David. He stopped. Sarah looked at him. I love you. David slowly turned around. Tears filled his eyes. I know. Sarah froze. David smiled. That's why I came. Then he opened the door and walked away. Sarah stood there. She watched him disappear. Then she looked at the old photograph. For the first time, she understood the real lesson. The future is not always waiting for us. Sometimes, the future is warning us. Sarah went home. She opened her calendar. She looked at the date. Then she deleted one word from her life. Later, from that day on, she stopped saying, I will call tomorrow. She stopped saying, I will visit next week. She stopped waiting for the perfect moment because she finally understood the perfect moment was already here. Maybe you are also waiting for later. Maybe you are waiting to call someone. Maybe you are waiting to say, I love you. Maybe you are waiting for the right time. But remember, tomorrow is not promised. So, who will you call today? And what will you say? Thank you for listening. And remember, you do not need to change your whole life today. Sometimes, you only need to make one different choice